Maeva Blackstone stood on the porch of Bellbrook Ranch, staring at the horizon where a black carriage cut through the dust. She didn't know the man inside, but she knew one thing for certain: men who came this far never left without taking something. Or someone. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying stories that would never be told aloud. The air was still, but the past stirred like a sleeping animal. The days seemed to stretch endlessly out here, on this forgotten piece of land at the edge of nowhere. Maeva Blackstone stood at the edge of the porch, her worn boots barely making a sound on the dusty floorboards. She gazed out at the expanse of dry, cracked earth stretching before her, the sun casting an orange glow on the distant hills. The air stirred in restless swirls, lifting tiny spirals of dust that clung to her boots, carrying with it the faint echo of forgotten footsteps. It wasn't the first time Maeva had stood there, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders, but today felt different. Today, the quiet was louder, like something was waiting for her, just beyond the horizon. Clara Hayes, her companion in this lonely existence, was inside the small, humble house, kneading dough for supper. The smell of fresh bread would soon fill the air, but even that couldn't chase away the sense of dread that Maeva couldn't quite shake. The creak of a wagon wheel broke the silence, cutting through the stillness like a knife. Maeva's body tensed, her eyes narrowing as she turned toward the sound. A cloud of dust rose in the distance, the outline of a black carriage coming into view, moving slowly across the horizon. It wasn't the typical wagon that passed through here. No. This one was larger, more imposing, its wheels creaking in a way that made Maeva's pulse quicken. She didn't move, didn't even shift her weight. She simply watched, waiting for the inevitable. The last time something like this had happened, it had been a man with a rough voice and a sharper look, demanding to know what two women were doing so far from town. That had been weeks ago, but the memory clung to her like the dust on her skin. The wagon crept closer, and Maeva could make out the figure of a man on the seat. He didn't have the typical cowboy hat, no weathered brim like most men around here. Instead, he wore a long, dark duster, his face mostly hidden by the shadows of the brim. His hair was dark at the roots, fading to gray at the edges. He had the look of someone who didn't want to be found, someone who had buried their past so deep it would take more than a lifetime to unearth. His name was Jasper Bellamy, and everything about him looked expensive except for the way he moved. His gait was deliberate, cautious as if every step was calculated. Each movement a decision weighed against 1,000 others. When the wagon finally came to a halt, the man didn't say a word. He simply sat there, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Maeva standing on the porch. Maeva didn't blink. She didn't move either. There was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her spine stiffen. But she didn't let him see it. Instead, she folded her arms across her chest, waiting for him to speak. The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. The wind ruffled Maeva's hair, sending a few strands flying across her face. It was then that the first words broke the stillness. "You're not ours anymore," he said, his voice low but steady. Maeva didn't flinch. She'd heard those words before. In fact, they had become all too familiar, ever since the day the men who had once claimed her as their own had decided she was no longer worth their trouble. She had been discarded, left behind, like so much trash. But she hadn't been broken. "I never was," she replied, her voice calm but firm. It was a lie. but it was a lie she had convinced herself of over time. The truth was too ugly, too painful to acknowledge. No one had ever claimed her, not in the way she had hoped, at least. And the men who had come before him had left her with nothing but dust and silence. He seemed to understand the weight of her words, though he gave no sign of it. Instead, he turned his gaze towards the horizon, his face expressionless. "I don't want trouble," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I came to offer you something more than that." Maeva's curiosity piqued, but she kept her expression neutral. "Something more?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "Like what?" The man finally climbed down from the wagon, the boots on his feet thudding softly against the earth as he approached. He didn't look like a man with good intentions. He looked like someone who had seen too much, someone who had no use for small talk or pleasantries. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a knife, its blade dull from use but clean. With a practiced movement, he cut the rope from the weathered fence, freeing it from the post where it had been tied. Maeva didn't speak as the rope fell to the ground, the cut precise, deliberate. Her heart thudded in her chest, her mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. But she didn't move. She wouldn't. She couldn't until she understood who this man was, what he truly wanted from her. When the rope had fallen, he turned toward her again, his eyes meeting hers with an odd steadiness. "I'm not here to take you back," he said softly. "I'm here to offer you a choice." Maeva blinked. A choice. Was it even possible to make a choice after everything that had happened? After everything that had been taken from her? "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Why would you offer anything to someone like me?" The question hung in the air, unspoken, yet understood. She had known men like him before, the kind who saw women as little more than things to be owned or discarded. But this man, this Jasper Bellamy, was different. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he carried himself. "I've seen what happens when people are left to wither away in silence," he said. "I don't want to see that happen to you." Maeva opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes still locked on his. He offered no further explanation. Instead, he turned and walked toward the back of the wagon, leaving her standing there, unsure of what to make of it all. She had lived through too many years of silence and abandonment to trust anyone, especially a man who came out of nowhere offering promises she couldn't bring herself to believe. But still, something in him called to her. Perhaps it was the quiet strength in his gaze, or perhaps it was simply the fact that someone who wasn't her, had finally seen her. Truly seen her. She could hear Clara's soft voice from inside the house, calling out to her. But Maeva didn't move. She remained where she was, watching Jasper as he prepared to leave. "I'm taking you to my place," he said, turning to face her one last time. "You'll have a roof over your head. You'll be safe. And when you're ready, you'll have the chance to make your own decisions." Maeva looked at him, the silence between them stretching once more. She had no idea what he meant by that, but something in the way he spoke, something in the way he carried himself, made her want to believe him. But belief was dangerous. Trust had gotten her nothing but pain. Still, she nodded slowly. There was nothing else left to say. Jasper turned and climbed back into the wagon, the horses already shifting restlessly, ready to leave. Maeva stood there for a moment longer, watching him, before she turned and walked back into the house. The door closed softly behind her, and Clara looked up from where she was preparing supper. Her face was full of questions, but Maeva simply shook her head. "We're leaving," Maeva said quietly. And though the words felt strange in her mouth, she knew they were true. The winds were shifting, and there was no going back now. As Maeva stood at the door, ready to follow Jasper Bellamy, she felt the weight of the decision settling on her chest. Outside, the shutters rattled under the weight of the night air, each creak a warning that something darker was already on its way, something that was still waiting to be discovered. The wind picked up, stirring the dust on the old trail to Cedar Hollow. The town, though small and faded, still carried the weight of secrets, some of which were beginning to surface. Maeva sat silently beside Clara in the back of the wagon, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The journey from Bellbrook Ranch to Cedar Hollow wasn't long, but the road felt endless under the heavy weight of the silence between them. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled over the dry, cracked earth, and the scent of leather and dust clung to the air. The world around them was vast, open, and empty, just like Maeva's heart felt after everything that had happened. Clara sat beside her, her hands folded neatly in her lap, trying to appear composed, though her nervous energy was palpable. Maeva could feel Clara's eyes on her, but she didn't meet them. There was nothing to say. No words could explain the uneasy feeling that settled deep in Maeva's chest, a sensation she had come to know too well in the years spent wandering the land, looking for a place to belong. And now, as they made their way toward Cedar Hollow, the town where everything had started, Maeva felt as though she were walking straight into the storm. The town was only a few miles away now, the distant outlines of the buildings beginning to appear on the horizon, their shapes jagged and worn, like the people who called this place home. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, and the coolness of the evening air was a welcome relief after the scorching heat of the day. But Maeva knew that the air around Cedar Hollow was thick with something darker than dust and wind. It was the kind of town where whispers traveled faster than dust devils, and the sound of gossip could be heard long before you ever set foot inside. As the wagon neared the outskirts of town, Maeva's thoughts wandered back to the conversation she'd had with Jasper earlier. His words echoed in her mind. "I'm not here to take you back. I'm here to offer you a choice." The simple promise had hung between them, a thread of possibility in the air, and yet Maeva couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another man making empty offers. She had learned long ago that men's promises were as fleeting as the wind. Jasper's quiet, unassuming demeanor had unsettled her. He didn't seem like the typical rancher, the kind of man who ruled with an iron fist or took what he wanted without a second thought. He had the look of someone who had spent too long hiding from the world, someone who had buried his past so deep that it would take a lifetime to unearth it. But Maeva couldn't trust that. She couldn't trust anyone anymore. As they entered the town, Maeva could feel the eyes of the residents on her. The air was thick with the weight of judgment, as though the entire town had known she was coming long before she arrived. The gossip had already begun. The whispers had carried through the dry air, reaching every corner of Cedar Hollow, every ear, every tongue. And now, as Maeva passed through the dusty streets, she could feel the eyes of the townfolk on her, like an invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders. Clara shifted beside her, fidgeting nervously as they passed by the general store. The door swung open as a man stepped out, his eyes narrowing as he saw the women. He tipped his hat to them, a forced gesture of politeness that Maeva could see through instantly. He was the type of man who pretended to respect a woman's place, but wouldn't hesitate to call her out the moment she stepped out of line. Maeva didn't return the greeting. Instead, she kept her eyes ahead, her focus on the path that lay before them. There was no turning back now. They were here. The town had seen them, and now it would be up to Maeva to decide what came next. The wagon rolled past the dusty old church that sat at the edge of town, its steeple crooked and weathered by the years. The once pristine white walls were chipped and faded, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, a symbol of a place that had once held some kind of meaning, but had long since lost its power. Maeva felt a pang in her chest at the sight of it, but she couldn't bring herself to care about the ruins of what was left behind. She had no time for things like faith and hope. She had learned that those things were only illusions in the world she had come to know. "Where do you think they're talking about us now?" Clara asked softly, her voice barely audible over the creak of the wagon wheels. Maeva didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure what to say. The truth was, Clara was right. They had both felt it. The change in the air, the shift in the town's mood as soon as they arrived. The whispers had started the moment they crossed the town's border, and Maeva knew that the people of Cedar Hollow wouldn't forget what had happened between her and the men who had abandoned her all those years ago. They would never forget that she was one of the women who had been left behind, cast aside like a piece of trash that no one cared to pick up. "I don't know," Maeva said quietly, her voice steady. "But they'll talk regardless of what we do." The wagon came to a stop in front of a small building at the edge of town. It wasn't much a worn, faded sign hung above the door, advertising rooms for rent, but the paint was peeling, and the windows were cracked. The kind of place that didn't ask questions about who walked through its door. Jasper climbed down from the wagon, his boots thudding softly on the ground as he turned to face Maeva and Clara. His eyes were still steady, but there was something different in his gaze, now something that made Maeva uneasy. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew this was the moment when everything would change. "You'll stay here for the night," Jasper said, his voice low but calm. "I'll take care of the arrangements. No one will bother you here." Maeva looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she had no choice but to follow him for now. After everything that had happened, there was no place else to turn. Clara looked uncertain, but she nodded, sensing the tension that had built up between Maeva and Jasper. She wasn't as hardened as Maeva, but she understood the importance of survival. The women followed Jasper into the building, the door creaking as they entered. The room inside was simple, nothing more than a bed, a small table, and a few chairs scattered around. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the night. Maeva could already feel the weight of the town's judgment closing in, but she knew there was nothing she could do about it. She could run, but it would always follow her. Jasper turned toward the door. "I'll be back in the morning. Don't go anywhere," he said. And then he stepped outside, leaving them alone in the dim light of the room. Maeva glanced at Clara, who was already sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. The uncertainty in her eyes mirrored Maeva's own. They both knew that this was just the beginning. There were more storms ahead. Maeva stood at the window, looking out at the town. A faint hiss slipped through the cracks in the walls, like the house itself was breathing, and somewhere beyond, muffled voices rose and fell with the night. And Maeva knew that what was coming next would change everything. The night was darker than usual, the kind of night where you could hear your own heartbeat. Maeva sat at the edge of the porch, staring into the blackness, feeling the world closing in around her. The wind had picked up again, and the dry sound of it scraping through the trees was the only noise in the otherwise still night. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder then words one that made everything feel heavier, as if the land itself was pressing in on her. Inside the room, Clara was already asleep, curled beneath a thin blanket, her breath soft and even. Maeva hadn't told her that she couldn't sleep, hadn't told her that the weight of everything pressing down on her chest felt like it might suffocate her. Clara, in her simple innocence, had no idea what it was like to carry the years of scars that Maeva did. She had no idea what it was like to walk through this world, carrying the burden of being discarded, of being left behind, like a piece of forgotten debris. Maeva's mind swirled, each thought more jumbled than the last. Jasper Bellamy's words echoed in her head, his offer hanging in the air between them like a promise she wasn't sure she could trust. "I'm here to offer you a choice," he said softly, his eyes darkening. "But if you refuse me, they will come for you. And they won't stop until there's nothing left of this place." But what kind of choice could a woman like Maeva have? She had already made her choices, had already fought to survive, and each time, the world had taken more than it had ever given back. She was tired, worn thin by the years, and she didn't know if she had anything left to give. A creak of the floorboard behind her broke through the fog of her thoughts. Maeva didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Brennan Coyle, the quiet man who had crossed her path several times since she had arrived in Cedar Hollow, stood a few paces behind her. His presence was always steady, like the earth beneath her feet. It was the kind of presence that Maeva hadn't known she needed until now. He said nothing, but his shadow cast itself across the porch, joining hers in the dim moonlight. "Can't sleep either?" Maeva asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brennan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, taking a seat beside her on the porch, his boots scraping the wood with a soft, familiar sound. Maeva didn't look at him, didn't need to. She knew he was there, just as she had known he would be. "It's not the sleep," he said after a while, his voice low but not harsh. "It's the waiting." Maeva nodded, her gaze still fixed on the dark expanse before her. The shadows of the trees stretched out like black fingers across the ground, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. She could see nothing but the faint outline of the town in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the starless sky. "I know," she said softly, "but the waiting never ends. It's just part of it, part of who we are now." Brennan was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon, though Maeva knew his mind was a million miles away. She didn't ask him about his past. She had learned long ago not to press people to speak of what they weren't ready to share, but she knew his silence was as heavy as her own. "You think they'll come after us?" Maeva asked, the question hanging in the air. She wasn't sure if she was asking him or herself, but she needed to hear it. She needed to know if he was thinking the same thing she was, that there was no escaping this life, no running from the past that followed like a shadow. "They always do," Brennan replied, his voice grim but steady. "The past doesn't stay buried for long." Maeva let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, the sound quiet but sharp in the night. She'd known it was true. She'd known that the weight of her past would always find a way to catch up with her. But that didn't make it any easier to hear. The sound of horses' hooves echoed in the distance, the steady rhythm cutting through the silence. Maeva tensed, her muscles stiffening as she turned her gaze toward the road. There was no mistaking the sound their arrival had been inevitable. Brennan stood, his eyes narrowing as the figure of a rider began to take shape in the distance. The moonlight glinted off the edges of the rider's coat, making the silhouette seem almost otherworldly. A dark figure against the night. Maeva stood as well, her heart pounding in her chest. It was him. Griffith Kane was here, and the way the wind shifted around them only made the moment feel more ominous. She could feel his presence in the air, a palpable thing that seemed to make the ground beneath her feet feel unsteady. "I'll handle this," Brennan said quietly, his voice full of determination. Maeva didn't argue. She didn't even move. She simply watched as he walked toward the edge of the porch, his hands steady at his sides. The man was like the land itself, solid, enduring, and unshakable. The rider drew closer, each hoofbeat like a drum of war. The wagon halted so abruptly the horses snorted in protest. Maeva's breath caught when she saw him. Griffith Kane. And in that instant, she realized his hand was already resting on his revolver, his tall form outlined against the moonlit sky. He was, as she remembered, tall, hard-faced, with a gaze that seemed to pierce straight through to the bone. There was no warmth in his expression, no kindness in his eyes. He was a man who had been built by the harsh winds of the world, and it showed in every line of his face. Brennan stopped at the edge of the porch, his gaze locked on the man in front of him. The tension between them was almost tangible, the air thick with unspoken words. Griffith Kane didn't dismount at first. He sat there, studying them both, as if deciding which of them was the more dangerous of the two. "You came here looking for shelter," Kane said, his voice cold, like the wind that had been blowing all night. "But don't mistake that for weakness. I don't care who you are, or where you've been. This town doesn't want you." Maeva felt the words like a slap, though her face remained impassive. It was the same judgment, the same rejection that had followed her for so long. She had expected it, but that didn't make it sting any less. "I'm not here to ask for your permission," Brennan said, his voice low but firm. "We're just passing through." Kane's eyes flicked to Maeva for the first time. There was a strange, almost predatory glint in his gaze as he took in her stillness, the way she stood like a woman who had nothing left to lose. He leaned forward in the saddle, his hand resting on the reins with a casual arrogance. "I think you'll find it's not that simple," Kane said softly. His voice was as cold as the night, and Maeva knew what he was really saying. They weren't just passing through. They had come to stay, whether the town liked it or not. The silence between them stretched, thick with the weight of everything that had come before, and everything that was about to come next. The night seemed to grow colder, the wind picking up again as if urging them to make a choice, to decide who would break first. Brennan didn't back down. He held Kane's gaze, unwavering, his jaw set in a way that made Maeva realize just how much more he had to offer than anyone had ever given him credit for. Kane, however, was different. There was a hunger in his eyes, a desire for something more than just power. It was the kind of hunger that could only be sated by breaking others. Maeva didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if Brennan would stand against Kane, or if the town would finally get what it had been waiting for. But she felt something stir deep inside her, something old and forgotten, like the spark of a long-extinguished flame, and for the first time in years, she knew that this was her fight. She didn't know how it would end, but she was ready to see it through. As the wind howled around them, Maeva stood frozen in place, her heart racing. Griffith Kane smiled, a cold, knowing smile. And for the first time, Maeva felt the weight of his gaze like a noose tightening around her neck. The question that had been on her mind all along now echoed louder than ever. How far would she go to survive? The sun rose like fire over Bellbrook Ranch, but it wasn't the warmth that Maeva felt. It was the creeping chill of knowing that something had to break. The quiet had been shattered, and it would never be the same again. The morning came too soon for Maeva, its light slicing through the curtains, a harsh reminder of the night's unease. She lay still for a moment, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. The air in the room was thick with dust, the scent of old wood and dried earth. The light from the cracked window cast long shadows on the floor, stretching across the room like dark fingers reaching for her. She hadn't slept. Not really. Her mind had been too busy with thoughts of the night before the confrontation with Griffith Kane and the weight of his words, lingering like a bad smell that wouldn't go away. Clara was still asleep in the corner, her face peaceful, oblivious to the battle Maeva was waging in her own mind. Maeva envied her that. But there was no peace for her, not after everything that had happened, not with the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She had fought too many battles, lost too much, to allow herself the luxury of sleep. Instead, she lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long it would take before the town finally came for her, before they ripped away whatever was left of her dignity. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. Maeva sat up, startled for a moment, before she steadied herself. It was a soft knock, hesitant, not the kind that meant trouble. Not yet. She got up, her feet cold against the wooden floor, and opened the door to find Brennan standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said quietly, his voice low and rough from sleep. "I need to talk to you." Maeva nodded, stepping aside to let him in. She hadn't expected him to show up so early, but there was no denying that the air between them had shifted in the last few days. He had been there when she needed him, and though they didn't speak of it, Maeva knew that something more was growing between them, a quiet understanding that they both carried burdens too heavy to put down. "I'm listening," Maeva said, closing the door softly behind him. She couldn't afford to be distracted by anything, not when there was so much at stake. Brennan took a step toward the window, looking out at the town in the distance. His posture was tense, his hands clasped behind his back. The town's talking. It's not just the men anymore, the women, the children. They know who you are. They know about what happened to you. Maeva swallowed hard. She had known this was coming, but hearing it aloud felt like a blow to the gut. The whispers of the past that had been buried for so long were rising to the surface, ready to drown her. She had spent years running from her past, from the men who had claimed her and discarded her, from the people who had used her as nothing more than a piece of property. And now, all of it was about to come crashing down on her again. "What do they want?" she asked, her voice tight, barely more than a whisper. Brennan turned to face her, his eyes dark with something Maeva couldn't quite place. "They want you to leave. They want you to vanish. Go back to where you came from. They're tired of the rumors, tired of the questions." Maeva felt a flicker of something inside her: anger, frustration, maybe even fear, but she didn't let it show. She had long ago learned how to keep her emotions buried beneath the surface, how to hide her true feelings from the world. "I'm not going anywhere," Maeva said firmly, her jaw clenched. "I've stayed here too long to turn tail now. They'll have to drag me out." Brennan nodded, as if he expected no less. But there was a sadness in his eyes that Maeva couldn't ignore. He had seen enough of the world to know that a woman like her, someone with her past, was never truly safe, no matter where she went. The past followed you, just like the wind followed the dust. There was no outrunning it, no escaping it. And if Maeva wanted to survive, she would have to fight. Maybe it's not the town that's the problem, Brennan said quietly. Maybe it's what's inside you that's holding you back. Maeva's breath caught in her throat. She knew exactly what he meant. The ghosts of her past, of everything she had endured and survived, were never far behind. No matter how hard she tried to bury them, they were always there, lurking in the corners of her mind, ready to drag her back into the darkness. I'm not afraid of them, Maeva replied, her voice stronger now. But I can't run from who I was. Brennan, I can't change what happened to me. No one's asking you to, he said, his voice gentle but insistent. But you can choose how to move forward. You can choose what to do with what's been done to you. His words struck her like a blow, but they weren't as painful as she expected. For the first time, Maeva felt like someone truly saw her, like someone understood the weight she carried. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was about finding a way to live with the scars, to find peace in the chaos. But before Maeva could say anything else, a loud knock came at the door, followed by a harsh voice calling from outside. Maeva Blackstone. You've got a lot of nerve showing your face here. The voice was unmistakable. Griffith Kane. Maeva's stomach twisted into knots, her pulse quickening. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Kane had been patient, biding his time, but now he had come to claim what he thought was his. Maeva exchanged a glance with Brennan, who was already moving toward the door, his expression hardening. He wasn't about to let this man walk in without a fight. I'll take care of this, Brennan said, his voice steady. Stay inside. But Maeva didn't move. She didn't need to be told to stay. This was her fight now, not Brennan's. She wasn't going to hide anymore. Maeva stood, her hands trembling slightly as she walked toward the door. She could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air, the silence in the room thick with anticipation. She had no idea what would happen next. But she knew one thing for certain. Griffith Kane had come to settle the score, and Maeva was ready to face him, no matter what it cost. As Maeva opened the door, the harsh light of the morning sun hit her face, blinding her for a moment. Griffith Kane stood on the threshold, his eyes cold and filled with contempt. The showdown had begun, and Maeva knew that there was no turning back now. The town of Cedar Hollow hadn't spoken the truth in years, but when Maeva walked through its streets, her silence spoke louder than any words. She was no longer hiding. She was making herself seen. The sun was high in the sky by the time Maeva and Brennan left the building. The heat of the day was settling in, heavy and relentless, as it always did in the late spring. The dust swirled around their feet, kicked up by the wind that felt almost like a warning. The streets of Cedar Hollow were empty for the most part. Most folks had learned long ago to keep their heads down and their voices lower when the wind began to carry rumors. Maeva walked with purpose, her boots clanging softly against the cracked wooden sidewalk. Brennan walked beside her, his posture steady, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was used to the quiet, used to the way people watched from their windows and doorways. Cedar Hollow was a small town, and small towns had a way of finding out everything, whether it was wanted or not. Maeva's stomach tightened with each step she took. She had been here before, in this very town. It wasn't a place that had ever shown her kindness, but it was the place where she had learned the most painful lessons about survival. The old memories rushed in, uninvited, and she pushed them back down. There was no time for them now. The first building they passed was the general store, its wooden sign hanging crookedly above the door. It had always been a place of both refuge and discomfort for Maeva. depending on the season and the weather. She had spent enough time there, buying supplies, exchanging pleasantries with the locals. But today, the air around the store felt different. The whispers started before they even reached the door, the sound of people talking behind curtains, behind closed doors. Maeva didn't look at anyone, but she could feel the eyes on her, feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her, like the heat of the sun itself. The sound of a door creaking open caught her attention. She turned her head slightly to see a woman step out of the general store. Her face was lined with age, her hands worn and weathered. But there was something in her eyes that Maeva recognized: fear. "Maeva Blackstone," the woman said, her voice hesitant but strong. "I didn't think you'd be back." Maeva stopped, her eyes narrowing slightly. She didn't know this woman, but there was something familiar in her tone, something that made Maeva's chest tighten with a mixture of anger and sadness. The people of Cedar Hollow had known her once, but only as the girl who had been sold off, discarded. Now, they saw her only as a ghost of that past, someone who didn't belong. "I'm not here to be forgotten," Maeva said, her voice steady. She was tired of being seen as less than, tired of being pushed to the edge of the world. It was time to stand tall. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she just stood there, her eyes lingering on Maeva for a moment too long. Then, with a deep sigh, she turned and went back inside, closing the door softly behind her. Maeva felt a brief pang of something regret, maybe, or a lost connection. She couldn't be sure. They continued down the street, the town growing smaller and smaller around them, the tension in the air thickening with each step. As they approached the center of town, Maeva could see the familiar faces of the townsfolk gathered at the edges of the street, standing in silence, watching her like a hawk circling its prey. Brennan stopped beside her, his gaze flicking over the crowd. But Maeva didn't need him to say anything. She knew they were all waiting for her to break, for her to run. The town had already decided what kind of woman she was, and they didn't care to see anything else. She had lived her life in fear of being judged by people who didn't understand her, by people who had never bothered to look past the surface. But today, she wasn't afraid. Today, she was going to face the truth, her truth, and if the town didn't like it, that was their problem, not hers. The door to the sheriff's office opened with a creak, and Maeva felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The sheriff, a man named Samuel Wicks, stepped out onto the porch, his boots clicking against the wood. His expression was unreadable, but Maeva could tell from the set of his jaw that he wasn't happy to see her. "What do you want?" the sheriff asked, his voice low and guarded. Maeva stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on her, could hear the hushed murmurs as they wondered what would happen next. "I'm here to tell you that I'm not going anywhere," Maeva said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet strength. "And I'm not going to let you or anyone else decide my fate for me." The sheriff didn't move for a moment, his gaze fixed on Maeva as if weighing her words. Then, he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You don't understand. Maeva," he said, his tone softer now. "This town, it's not the same as it used to be. People are scared. They're tired of all the rumors, the gossip. And now you come back after everything that happened, and you think things are going to be different." "I don't care about the gossip," Maeva said, her voice rising now. "I care about the truth. And the truth is, this town has a choice to make. Either you accept me for who I am, or you keep running from the reality of what you've all done." The sheriff stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face as if trying to figure out if she was lying. Finally, he shook his head. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" he muttered, more to himself than to Maeva. Maeva didn't answer. She didn't need to. She had already made her choice, and she wasn't going to back down. Before she could turn away, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind her. She didn't have to look to know who it was. Griffith Kane had arrived. The crowd parted as Kane walked toward her, his tall frame cutting through the tension like a knife. His eyes were cold, his expression unreadable. He stopped a few feet away from Maeva, his gaze flicking from her to the sheriff, and then back to Maeva. "I told you before," Kane said, his voice low and menacing. "This town doesn't want you, and I won't let you stay here, causing trouble." Maeva's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't back away. She stood her ground, meeting Kane's icy stare with the same defiance that had carried her this far. "I'm not leaving," Maeva said, her voice clear and unwavering. "If you want me gone, you'll have to drag me out, and I won't make it easy." Kane smirked, the coldness in his eyes deepening. "You're making a mistake, Maeva. This town won't forgive you, and neither will I." Maeva stood her ground, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her words. Griffith Kane took one last look at her, his smirk turning into something darker, and for a moment, Maeva wondered what he would do next. The silence between them stretched, and the air felt thick with anticipation. She had made her choice now. She would have to face the consequences. The wind shifted, and Maeva knew it wasn't just the weather. The ground was stirring beneath her feet, and everything was about to change. The oppressive heat of the day hung heavy in the air, the sun stretching lazily over the horizon as though it had nowhere else to be. The streets of Cedar Hollow had quieted, the earlier buzz of whispers and gossip dying down as the townsfolk retreated to the coolness of their homes. The scent of dry earth mingled with the distant smell of fresh bread baking. But to Maeva, it all felt faint, distant, as if she were looking at it from a place far beyond the reach of this town. She stood there, staring at Griffith Kane, the cold smirk still on his lips, his eyes calculating as they measured her up, weighing her every movement. She could feel the eyes of the town on her, but she couldn't let herself flinch. Not now. Not when she had come this far. Brennan stood silently beside her, his face unreadable. His presence was a comfort, a steadying force in a moment that Maeva knew was critical. She had already walked through so much pain, so much abandonment, but this was something else. Kane had come for her. He had come to settle things, to put her in her place, and for the first time, Maeva wasn't going to let him. "You don't have to do this," Kane said, his voice quiet, almost persuasive, as if trying to convince her that he was offering her an easy way out. "You could leave. You could disappear, and everything would go back to normal. No one would ever have to know what happened." Maeva's pulse quickened, her breath shallow as she held his gaze. "I don't need your forgiveness," she said, her voice steady but fierce. "I didn't come back here for you. I didn't come back here for any of them. I came back for me. And I'm not running from who I am anymore." Kane's lips tightened into a thin line, the veneer of calm starting to crack. "You're making a mistake, Maeva. A woman like you doesn't belong here. You don't fit in this town. I never belonged here to begin with." Maeva shot back, her eyes narrowing. "I've been nothing but a shadow in your eyes." Haven't I just another one of your stories? Just another woman who could be discarded without consequence. His eyes flicked to the crowd gathered at the edge of the street, their expressions a mix of fear, judgment, and curiosity. But Maeva wasn't looking at them. She was looking at Kane, at the man who had tried to force her into the role he had written for her. "You're right," she continued, her voice low but firm. "I'm not your property, and I'm not anyone's to command. I'm done letting people like you tell me who I am." Kane took a step toward her, his boots making the familiar sound against the ground, the air thick with the tension between them. The small crowd held its breath, unsure of what was coming next. "I won't let you ruin this town," he said, his voice dangerous now, a low rumble beneath the surface. "You're already tainting it with your presence. People are scared of what you bring with you. Your past is a weight on this town's shoulders, Maeva. And no matter how much you fight, no matter how much you think you've changed, they won't ever let you forget it." Maeva's hands clenched into fists at her sides, the words sinking deep into her skin. She had heard it all before, the accusations, the blame, the weight of others' expectations placed upon her shoulders. But it no longer mattered. The past had shaped her, but it didn't define her. "I'm not here to make anyone comfortable," Maeva said, her eyes cold now. "I'm here to stand my ground. If you want to fight, then fight. But you won't break me." There was a moment of stillness, and then Kane laughed. It was a bitter, cruel sound that echoed through the silent street. "You think you can stand against me?" he asked, his voice a mockery. "You think the town will follow you? They'll turn on you just like they turned on me. Just like they turned on everyone who tried to fight against what they think is right." Maeva didn't answer. She didn't have to. She had already made up her mind. There was no going back from this. With a slow, deliberate movement, Kane reached for his side, pulling out a small revolver. The sight of it was enough to make Maeva's heart skip, but she didn't flinch. She had seen weapons before. She had seen men with power and violence in their eyes. This was no different. Brennan tensed beside her, his hand twitching at his side, ready to react. But Maeva raised a hand to stop him. She wasn't going to be intimidated. Not by Kane. Not by anyone. "You don't need to do this," she said again, her voice steady. But it was clear to both of them that the moment had already passed. The challenge had been set. Kane's fingers tightened around the handle of the gun, his eyes fixed on Maeva with cold, unyielding determination. But before he could make a move, a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. "Stop." The voice was familiar, and Maeva's heart skipped a beat. It was Clara, her face pale and filled with panic as she rushed toward the center of the street. Maeva felt the heat rise in her chest, a sudden wave of panic flooding her. She had come here to face Kane, to settle things once and for all. But seeing Clara out in the open, seeing the fear in her eyes, changed everything. "Clara, get back!" Maeva shouted, stepping forward. But Clara was already too close. "I'm not going to stand by and watch this happen," Clara said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You don't have to do this. Maeva, we've fought for so long. Don't let him take this from you." The crowd shifted, murmuring in quiet shock at Clara's words. Maeva could feel the weight of her friend's presence beside her, but the tension in the air was unbearable. Kane's gun was still aimed at Maeva, and every second stretched longer than it should. It was a standoff, and Maeva had to make her choice. "You'll never be free," Kane spat, his voice full of venom. "You'll never escape your past. Not in this town. Not anywhere." Maeva felt the truth of those words like a slap in the face. But it didn't matter. She had fought too hard, survived too much, to let him win now. "I'm not running," Maeva said firmly, her voice clear. "Not now. Not ever." Kane's finger tightened on the trigger, his cold smile fixed on Maeva. Clara moved closer, her breath trembling. "You think you can stand against me?" Kane sneered, his voice carrying across the silent street. "This town will never follow you." Maeva didn't blink. "I don't need them to follow me." Her voice was steady, sharper than the tension in the air. "I just need you to stop." Kane's laugh was bitter. "You won't stop me, Maeva. You're still the same scared girl I left behind." "No," Maeva said, her eyes locking onto his. "Not anymore." Before Kane could pull the trigger, Brennan stepped between them, his revolver drawn. The click of the hammer echoed like a thunderclap in the silence. "Drop it, Kane," Brennan ordered. His voice was low, steady, deadly. Kane's smile faltered, but he didn't lower his gun. "You won't shoot me. Try me," Brennan growled. Kane's gaze darted between Maeva and Brennan, weighing his chances. The crowd, silent until now, began to shift nervously. Someone whispered, "Let him go." Kane's jaw tightened, his hand twitching. And then, bang, the shot rang out, shattering the heavy silence. Kane's gun slipped from his hand as he stumbled backward, a red bloom spreading across his coat. His eyes widened in shock as he fell to his knees, staring at Maeva like he couldn't believe she was still standing. Brennan lowered his smoking revolver, his expression unreadable. Maeva didn't move at first. She simply stared at Kane, her chest rising and falling with the weight of what had just happened. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but unwavering. "You should have left me in peace, Kane." Kane's head dropped, his strength giving way as he collapsed onto the dusty street. The crowd stayed frozen, the only sound the distant creak of a swinging sign in the wind. The town, the people, the fight. It all came down to one final choice. Would Maeva stand her ground, or would Kane force her into a corner from which she couldn't escape? As the last of the light faded over Bellbrook Ranch, the wind began to pick up again, carrying with it the scent of dust and wildflowers, a reminder of the untamed spirit of the land that had witnessed more than its fair share of sorrow and survival. The silence that hung over the ranch seemed heavier now, like a memory too thick to breathe through, yet somehow filled with a quiet peace that hadn't been there before. The sound of a distant horse's hooves echoed through the night, a soft reminder of journeys taken and lives lived in the shadows. The twilight stretched long across the land, painting the earth in hues of gold and violet, the same colors that had stained the sky for countless years. Before justice was a whispered dream and honor, a forgotten relic. There was a lingering warmth in the cool evening air, something like forgiveness, or maybe something more elusive, the hum of humanity's true strength that had finally emerged from a place once buried deep in a woman's heart. Maeva, standing on the worn porch of the ranch, no longer felt the weight of the past pressing down on her as it once had. The ghosts of the men who had abandoned her, the voices of a town that had judged her, had faded into the evening air, slipping away like smoke in the wind. Her story, once nothing but a chapter lost to time, had become a thread woven into the fabric of something far greater than herself, something that had always been waiting to be heard. As a slow breath moved across the prairie, bending the long grasses as if the land itself was exhaling after holding its secrets too long. The faint sound of a letter's pages fluttering in a half-empty room seemed to echo the sentiment that some stories take longer to be told, but they are never lost. The truth had lived for years beneath the surface, unnoticed by most, hidden in the heart of a forgotten woman. But it had not been buried forever. It had taken its time, but the winds of fate had blown it back into the light. The lessons of that truth lingered in the quiet spaces between the stars that now dotted the dark sky above. Honor, it seemed, could be buried by time, by people, by distance, but it would always find a way to rise again, no matter how deep it was hidden. Justice, like an old, weathered carriage, might be slow, creaking along in the dust, but it still mattered. And even when the world turned its back, even when the shadows seemed too thick to see through, one woman, standing still in the center of it all, had kept the truth alive. The fire in her soul, the strength in her silence, had shaped a new world in the quietest of ways, without violence, without revenge, but through sheer will and the enduring belief that no one was truly beyond redemption. For Maeva, there would never be a true ending, but only an unfolding, like the sun setting over the horizon, the day ending, and yet still waiting to rise again. It was a story of hope, not for the promise of perfect justice, but for the understanding that sometimes it was enough to simply be heard, even if no one else believed. The forgotten woman, her name whispered on the wind. The pages of her life, written in the old dust of this land, was the keeper of a lost hope, a keeper of what it meant to stand firm when everything in the world told you to bow. And as Maeva watched the sky, she realized that it had all been worth it, the long years of silence, the weight of guilt, the townsfolk who never truly saw her. She had become more than they had ever imagined, and in that, she had claimed her place among the stars. If there's still a part of you that believes in the value of honor, the power of redemption, and the quiet strength it takes to stand against the storm, then perhaps it's time to say something. Maybe it's time to leave a mark, a sign that you, too, understand the weight of this land and the quiet echo of the stories still waiting to be told. If you believe, as Maeva did, that sometimes the truth only needs one person to carry it, type 1 and let us know. And if you want to hear more stories like this, filled with grit and grace, subscribe to the Western Story Chronicles. There's always another story waiting in the wind.